Hello and welcome to Mutually Assured Conversation. I'm here with my good friends Owen Leyshon, aka Raymond K. Hessel, and Joshua Hansen. Boys, we're talking about your new course, Thinking at Lightspeed, which is sort of a new course in the burgeoning field of Virilio studies, as you guys are calling it. I'm just wondering because I've never read him and actually never heard of him before you guys start speaking about it. Who is Paul Virilio?
Hey, thanks a lot, Samuel. Appreciate it. So again, I'm Joshua Hansen, and I'm an independent scholar. I'm also an author. I just put out a book in the past couple of months, the Tractatus Anti-Academicus. It's a critique of the U.S. college and university system. And I also have interests in areas like hypermodernism, where Virilio is key, and then also basically the field of Virilio studies. And so basically, as far as who he's somebody who he's in a number of different areas. So he's basically an urbanist, a cultural theorist, a phenomenologist. He is somebody who is a critic of the art of technology, and he also has been called by a bunch of very interesting sort of monikers. So he's been called an archaeologist of the future. He's somebody who has been he's been referred to as basically the high priest of speed. He's somebody who has been called a prophet of the wired future. And basically, he's the author of over 30 books, numerous articles, and interviews. He's done a number of museum exhibits, and so basically he's touched on he just has a huge sort of body of work. And as far as analysis of the current sort of state of affairs, as far as, let's say, technological acceleration, towards what he calls a technical beyond. I would say that, Virilio is one of the most accurate theorists in terms of his predictions, just like the most prescient, probably of almost any 20th century thinker. And furthermore, as far as moving forward, I think he's incredibly important if we are going to basically manage our affairs within the domain of what, like, Zizek calls, let's say, post-human capitalism, or what have you. Basically, genetic engineering, endocolonization of the human body through technology, increasing voluntary immobilization of the human body through technology, and a number of other associated aspects, including, let's say, warfare, virtual reality, cyberspace, and basically a number of different concerns all along this overall vector.
Cool. So you mentioned he's like a prescient thinker, is what you think, right? So, like, why is he important? Why should we study Virilio in 2023?
Okay, I can jump on that one. I think the lockdowns were a really good kind of practical.
That's the quote. The lockdowns weren't really good.
I mean, like, no, I think
I agree.
They were a good example of why Virilio's work became more prescient and accurate during the time.
Mm.
So one of the big issues that Virilio will talk about is instant communication and the technologies of instant communication, and these are kind of based around his theories of speed. So he's speed, like understanding speed from a phenomenological and even a political perspective, which is strange to think about at first when you first encounter, like, one of his books is called Speed and Politics, and you're like, how can speed be political? Because it's a we normally think of this in more so in the category of physics, right? So but the sort of history of speed, which Virilio gives us, goes from, we start out in a more metabolic era. We can run, we use horses and so on. Then we go into the kind of industrial era where we have motors and cars, and then we go into the informational era where we're sending around information to each other instantaneously. And it's like, you kind of have to do the course in a way to understand how instantaneous communication is phenomenologically important and is political. Like, it's difficult for me to just explain to you now. It would take me like 3 hours, but it basically is. And I think that to give you a few vague ideas, phenomenologically, we're de-worlded from our local particular world. So so for the example I give in the course is during the lockdowns, there was these protests in the US, and over BLM stuff. And I was seeing like BLM signs in Ireland, and I was like, that doesn't make any sense in Ireland. I mean, we don't really have a history of race relations and all that would suit, that sort of political framework. But I was like, but we're all living on this virtual network where we don't really care about what's actually in our local community or like in our local vicinity. We're just kind of engaged in this delocalized network of communication. And therefore, this delocalized, and the kind of key thing to understand here is that speed destroys space. So if you can imagine you can transport from one continent to another like that in like some sort of machine, you're not experiencing the buffering distances and the actual space that would be in between you and where you're going. This technology basically does that. And one of many, but one issue that is a consequence of this is that it delocalizes us and despatializes us, so that we can't really address, for example, political crises within an actual world that we're in. We're kind of de-worlded. And then this leads to lots of obfuscations and so on. So, he's kind of thinking of like digital, how the digital world sort of acts as an illusion, but it's not an illusion of virtuality. It's more an illusion through what speed causes, which is like a departicularization of where you are spatially. So that's like one Virillian issue. And I think the lockdowns really showed us how much that, like how big of a problem that is. And then, because we're all using this technology now a lot, it's going to continue to be a problem.
Yeah. I suppose to take those two concepts, like the speed and space stuff, like all the sort of tracking that was done during COVID is a good example of speed, right? And then the fact that you could just stay at home and get food delivered and watch the news from just your pod, that's a good example of how people say, oh, it's a small world today. It's a good example of how space is sort of contracted. So I don't know, we've got speed and space there. What are the other sort of core concepts of Virilio, and which ones are you going to cover in this course?
Sure. So we've taken his overall body of work and we've broken it down into, let's say, 6 main categories of analysis. A couple different ways you could cut the pie, but basically we're looking at speed, space in terms of territory, emotional synchronization, basically Virilio's analysis of the accident, his analysis of aesthetics, which is actually quite extensive. He started basically in the arts and then works his way from there. And then furthermore, basically what he calls gray ecology, which is a particular sort of response to sort of all of the above in a sense. And, one aspect that is really at the forefront and also relates to, let's say, COVID and, sort of the administration of fear during this whole thing is basically the feedback loop in between what he calls extreme science on the one hand, and then the propaganda of progress. So by way of example, you could say that COVID, no matter how you assess it, it is a technical progress accident, in the sense that we're talking about unprecedented logistics, allowing sort of the spread of pathogens. In the meantime, as an overall response to this, Owen just sent me the article the other day where I think they just awarded the Nobel Prize to a scientist, it might have even been a pair. I didn't even assess this very closely, but who were intimately involved in the development of mRNA technologies vis-a-vis the vaccines and so forth. And so, sort of, on the one hand, you have this technical progress accident of unprecedented transmission of pathogens. And then on the other hand, you have, okay, so, we've developed, let's say techno-scientific countermeasures to this sort of thing. But ultimately, lurking beneath the surface of all of this, and this is sort of what Virilio's main body of work is sort of pointing to, is the idea that we are basically at ground zero for increasing anthropogenic catastrophe, in a sense where at some point it may be possible to have a fully integrated technical progress accident when you combine, let's say, the speed of, totally interactive telecommunications, with some of these other developments, and then thus, you could have something like, I don't know, the fully automated euthanasia of the entire species. So this would be at the extreme here, but so the idea here is that every development always already contains within it a certain accident or a potentiality for disaster, catastrophe, what have you. And this is something that was not really, the only way somebody could know this is through historical analysis. He engages with Aristotle. Aristotle has a very specific analysis of the accident in his Metaphysics and in a couple other places. What the difference is that he didn't have the sort of benefit of, like hindsight in seeing the fact that, like the 20th century. And in the analysis of the 20th century, Virilio points to events in particular, such as, let's say, Auschwitz and Hiroshima, where basically in both, what you happen to have is sort of many of the advents coming out of the Industrial Revolution now rededicated to the systematic destruction of human life. And, so now that is then covered up by the propaganda of progress, by which a lot of this stuff is represented as, basically constituting, an advance that, speaks to some deeper valuation or something like that. And that is basically what he is attempting to expose.
Right. Yeah. As I said sort of at the beginning, at least to me, I mean, maybe I'm just not very well read, is Virilio seems kind of obscure. I didn't really hear of him or know about him, despite doing some some academic studies in philosophy, for example. I know it's not sociology, but it's at least tangentially related. He's not as noted as some other writers, at least on tech. You've got Heidegger, Deleuze, and even Spengler, who are pretty well known for their writings as part of the corpus. Is there a reason for that? I mean, I don't want to get like conspiracy theory on it, but like he does seem like someone you really have to know, if you know what I mean. And I'm just sort of wondering how he fits into the narrative of sociology and philosophy, because I know that he worked and taught along some people we will know.
Okay, I'll give you some sort of, it's my idea of why he's less taught. I think that the events which are making him relevant are only happening now in the past few years. And I think that that's one of the reasons. So we're kind of in a catch up. Like, oh, this guy had something to say. Okay. Like sometimes if of certain events which he was really focusing on, if they haven't sort of reached a certain threshold, then and sort of actualized themselves and revealed themselves to us in our daily lives, then sometimes we just kind of say, okay, that guy has some interesting ideas, but maybe, whatever, we'll concentrate on this person or that person. So I think there's kind of thresholds which make people relevant. And I think we could be seeing that happening now. That's one speculation on why. One other kind of just stylistic issue I think with him is that he does use a lot of jargon. He is quite bombastic, and he does dance around with two different topics constantly. He kind of talks about the course, as Joshua was saying, we go over speed, we go over accidents, aesthetics, all these different areas, and they are very interrelated and they are coherent, but it's kind of tricky to get a grasp on their coherence because he is quite a he has a very postmodern writing style. I wouldn't put him in the postmodern category, but he does have a postmodern style. So so those are at least two reasons why I think maybe that he hasn't been that relevant, but I'm not sure. Joshua might have some other answers.
Yeah, I do have a couple. It is difficult to place him. I think, according to his self-understanding, he wouldn't put himself within the realm of sociology or philosophy. He sort of explicitly stated that that he's a phenomenologist. He sees himself within a certain realm of theory, and he also believes that sociology was invented to ignore politics, which is almost a direct quote from him. And so I have seen other people give an analysis of, sort of as it relates to his fortunes, within the register philosophy. And on the one hand, when 9/11 occurred, like every media outlet wanted to reach out to him because of the fact that it runs along the same lines as much of his work. And I really think that he is actually one of the most acute analysts of 9/11 and everything bound up with that, which is actually quite complex. You have other people that have done the same, Zizek, Baudrillard, and so forth. But so now the issue was that once the election of Obama took place, President Obama, because of the overall sort of new feeling of hope and change, sort of Virilio's like gritty, hardened realism is something that therefore took a back seat. And he does. So there's maybe a couple of stylistic reasons as well. One is that he does engage with some of the most extreme pessimists, let's say like Emile Cioran, who basically wrote The Trouble with Being Born. That's somebody he quotes frequently, but at the same time, he does not identify as a pessimist. He actually, his perspective is because he claims to look at what the unfolding of technology actually does, and because of that therefore makes him merely a true lover of new technologies. That's kind of how he puts it. So that's on the one hand where he would regard himself as more of a realist than anything else, but at the same time, he has what's been described as a scattergun style. And I figured out a way to map this, which is that he was very interested in Impressionist art and also worked with he knew and worked with some of very major Impressionists, such as Matisse. He actually knew and worked with this individual. And he found Impressionism to be very interesting as like a response to technical progress, in the sense that you have portrait photography coming in. And in the meantime, what the Impressionists are doing is they're preserving sort of the phenomenological moment that is bound up, with the glance. And so I actually see his writing as almost a sort of Impressionism because it's very fast. And he uses this style by which he paints an impression of what he's driving at, but then he jumps to the next issue from there. So there's a lot of pycnoleptic jump cuts, and in a certain sense, this is very consistent with sort of living life in the contemporary scene, where you're constantly inundated with data on sort of a nonstop, cyclic rate. And so that's on the one hand. On the other hand, there's like deep engagement with, fairly heady sort of philosophical texts. At the same time, he's a big influence on Deleuze and Guattari. So that is one place where you could see him. He's quoted a couple dozen times in 1,000 Plateaus. And furthermore, he also, as Owen alluded to, he has this, he engages in coming up with neologisms on just like it's at a phenomenal rate. It's really unbelievable. And the issue with that is some of them are quite good, I have to say. Whereas at the same time, some of them I disagree with. And then also there's the issue of translation from French. So some of this stuff may play better, you know, in its original tongue than it does when it translates over. But some of these, like his book titles, exemplify this. So you have, like, let's say, polar inertia is one, the aesthetics of disappearance, you know, basically the what is it? The logistics of perception. He has sort of ideas and constellations of ideas like this that are, you know, quite impressive, actually. But you know, these are also reasons that make him at first blush maybe either somewhat difficult, intimidating, or so on and so forth. And you know, that's something that we try to interpenetrate and sort of, you know, isolate and render that understanding more intelligible.
Right. Yeah. And so I'm just I've got some questions that are kind of about I mean, because obviously we want people to actually take this course. I think that, you know, we've done some good stuff to overview what Virilio is about and sort of whet people's appetite to actually take the course. But I'm kind of interested, I've got some questions about like the practicalities of what you guys have done here. As someone on the outside who's very interested in alt academia and all these, you know, things that are going on, people creating courses online, that sort of stuff. I've got some questions about how you guys put this together. So, is this sort of a collaboration in the sense you wrote like the syllabus together, or is it kind of a course of two halves? You know, like it's a sort of back and forth, a bit like a rap battle or something like
that? Well, okay. So what happened was I was just reading loads of Virilio for the past few years, and I kind of thought, oh, it would be good to do a course on this guy. And then after a while, I realized it will take me years to actually understand all of his work enough to do this myself. So I was like, okay, well, Joshua is also really into Virilio, so I'll reach out to him and see if we can like split down the middle, kind of divide the labor half and half. And the categories that we decided on was that I was going to do speed, space, and emotional synchronization. And this is just so people know what emotional synchronization means, because it's kind of a strange term. It's basically the synchronicity of our emotions, which this sort of instantaneous communication media causes. So really often writes that in the 20th century it was all about the standardization of opinion, and in the 21st century it's the synchronization of emotion. It's the kind of internet product of media consumption. But anyway, so after that I was like, okay, so but many of these other categories which Josh is teaching, so you've got accidents, you've got aesthetics, and you've got gray ecology, which is I'm least knowledgeable on gray ecology in Virilio, so you'll have to ask Joshua about that one. But so that's basically how we came up with the kind of course structure. It was quite spontaneous, and we just kind of chose the ones we were interested in. You know, there wasn't a lot of like a kind of debate about who gets to do what ones. For some reason, we were just kind of okay, cool, we'll do that ones. I think the speed space one is obviously very relatable. So I think if you're going to do one of those, you have to do two of them, because they're kind of just intrinsically the same thing. And I think that once you understand the speed and space stuff, when you're then talking about these, let's say, more practical issues like accidents, like, you know, like viruses leaking from a laboratory, or 9/11, or you know, or you're talking about like propaganda, emotional synchronization. In the emotional synchronization lecture, I use the ooh, salad so good girl. You know, I can't remember what her name is. You know, that girl who's you know, the TikTok thing.
Yeah, my favorite.
As an example of that, of like the kind of social and psychological consequences of what is basically like a casino psychology, like instant feedback, you know. And So like these practical issues, like reveal themselves in a different light once you have that speed space, which is a bit more of a nitty gritty kind of theoretical understanding. Once you have those things down, you start to see these other more practical issues and in a more revealing light. So I don't know like if that really answers your question, but
Yeah.
that's kind of just how we did it. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I'm not sure if you have anything to add, Joshua. I'm just kind of wondering like how it's laid out. Like, kind of, is it a thing that you guys wrote together, or is it kind of half and half? Sounds like half and half. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically, sorry, apologies. Yeah, I had read Virilio for a couple of years. We had done a previous conversation on Virilio. He's written over 30 books. I had an unusual experience where at one point I purchased a lot of Virilio texts on the internet, like an entire lot. I think it was supposed to include like over 10. And whoever the bookseller was, they included like it was close to 16 of his works just in one shot for highly affordable price. So at that point I almost had the entire Virilio canon just purchased like budget rate, and I was like, this is amazing. So I started reading them, and lo and behold, then Owen reached out to me and was like, hey, do you want to do a course on Virilio? And I was like, basically, not only do I have almost all of the texts, I've been increased. The more I've read the guy, the more I would say that the way I compare it would be like if Zizek is a Lacanian. Basically, I would say I'm a Virillian in not a totally dissimilar sense. It definitely, I'm not sure that I actually disagree with them on a lot of questions, but I'm definitely in the camp of I think he's one of the best people to look to for theoretical insights on the contemporary scene. And as far as constructing the course, we broke down the overall situation. The split was quite natural. And then at that point, we built out our own projects. And the way that the course unfolds is basically Owen gives the first 3 lectures. I give the last 3, and then I try to sum it up in such a way that is really sort of almost action oriented in terms of what are the practical insights of Virilio's analysis, and how might they be relevant, politically, ethically, and otherwise, sort of going forward.
Cool. I'm wondering if you guys had any sort of interpretations or conclusions that you had any sort of major disagreements on, like, or maybe like the practicalities. Were there any like sort of major disagreements between you guys? Don't have to answer that one if you don't want to. But...
Not yet, no. But like we might when we do the seminars, because like our lecture, because like the lectures are all up, and you can buy the lectures now. But like as you're doing the course, Sam, you'll see that we might have some disagreements. Nothing that I've seen so far, particularly. And I think that's just and I think that speaks to the fact that the Virilio was quite coherent in maintaining a theory that moves through all these different categories, and without contradicting himself really along the way. So I'm not sure. So far we haven't had any major disagreements over interpretations or anything, but we might. So find out,
Yeah. No, I think that's a good reason for people to do the seminars as well. I think it'll be interesting to have those discussions. So, I mean, just off the back of that question, like, what are you guys most proud of in what you've produced in the course? Like, what do you think are the strongest sections? And have you got any like highlights of Virilio's writings for someone like me who hasn't read anything, to sort of like that should be a starting point or something like
that? We do. I'll just answer the last one first. As far as a starting point, if somebody hasn't read Virilio, I would definitely recommend The Administration of Fear, which is an interview book, very short book, very sort of snappy read. Now, here's the thing with Virilio is that there really is something for almost every occasion, in the sense that you have these short sort of, very concentrated presentations of what he's on about. At the same time, he has some much more dense theoretical books. For instance, one is Speed in Politics, but also Lost Dimension is something that is a very heady, still very, apropos text. Another one is The Art of the Motor, which might be his main analysis of technology and its unfolding, as well as The Aesthetics of Disappearance. These are all like really these are not easy texts to tackle. So on the one hand, you have the information bomb, the administration of fear, the accident of art. These are much more accessible texts, and he has a whole an entire portfolio of these. There's a lot of diversity there. As far as so far, what I would say that I'm most proud of in the course is my analysis of aesthetics. I have a theory sort of Virilio where I think that his early texts are much more difficult to understand. They're harder to penetrate. And that as he goes on, by the time that he arrives, he starts in Speed, he arrives at the accident, which is a quite natural and logical sort of progression. And at that point, coupled with his analysis of aesthetics, this is what drives all of his sort of conclusions that he makes once he's reached, like, let's say, full maturity as a thinker. And so basically, I'm covering a big part of that latter aspect, including his analysis of the accident, which I think is crucial. But he wrote, I would say, just to guesstimate, maybe 10 texts on the subject matter of aesthetics. And, it's amazing how sort of appropriate this is, and how relevant it is in terms of, like, there's one way where you could say we're involved in an aesthetic discourse right now, just via technological and framing. The entire, let's say, the whole like the polar inertia of the pod in the middle of COVID is also largely aesthetic, because we're talking about, basically new logistics of perception that have been accelerated by what he calls the art of the motor. Basically, you start with film. Now there's an overall aesthetics of disappearance. And so, and then also he traces out, let's say, the unfolding of nihilism in the pre and post World War II epoch, and sort of the way that it has informed art as well through, let's say, German Impressionism, Viennese Actionism, the French New Extremity, all the way to, basically the present state of art, which is constantly sort of inundated with, what, let's say, you could describe as blood, torture, death, and terror, sort of on a nonstop cybernetic basis. And so basically, I think that's extremely relevant. And, also his solution set. So, yeah, so that's the thing is, I think the one thing that Owen and I might ultimately disagree on is how we weigh the import of various aspects of his, his work and his overall project. And basically also, what the viability of some of the solution sets are. But that is yet to be seen, and I'm actually, I'm looking forward to the dispute, as it were.
Yeah. Do you want me to jump in and answer the same question?
Go for it.
Yeah. So, what was the question again? I'm joking. So, was it? Yeah. The area you said you were most proud of, or most intrigued by, I definitely think, because, as you know, I've written something about being in a pod, Notes from the Pod, which is very much based around the kind of phenomenology of lockdowns and being stuck in a space where basically the world is virtualized around you instead of you moving around the world. So the way I have increasingly now, and I wrote that initially when I was familiar with Virilio and read a few of his texts, but I hadn't read the main ones that he had specifically basically made that exact argument. But he made them like 20, 30 years ago, which was pretty insightful. So when the text Polar Inertia, which Joshua mentioned earlier, that is basically the text where he claims that virtual technologies, instant communication technologies like this, are what he calls the last vehicle. So a lot of his stuff, he kind of does a history of technological innovation based around speed as well, how speed has gotten faster and faster. And he says that, we had these literal vehicles that we would sit in and or stand in and would move us from A to B. And eventually we stopped innovating on, getting faster cars or faster trains or faster planes, because we just basically have the capacity now to use this information technology to bring the world to us instead of moving faster around it. So I thought that was just kind of like an obvious but brilliant insight. You know what I mean? And I think he explores, I would say, also crisis in how we understand ourselves spatially. Because that is a spatial crisis. I mean, the lockdowns were all about a spatial crisis, like stay 2 meters away from each other. Don't travel 2 kilometers out of your area. We have now the idea of 15-minute cities. And I was watching an Unheard interview with Matthew Crawford. I don't know if you know Matthew Crawford, the kind of, he's a mechanic as well, and he repairs cars, and he writes a lot about driving and the kind of phenomenology of driving. And yeah, they were talking about the same thing. This kind of attack on movement and so on. So, and being interested in also Peter Sloterdijk, who is also, I would say, another spatial thinker, who wrote a trilogy, Spheres, which he talks a lot about the effect when we found out that the sun doesn't move around the Earth. But the Earth moves around the sun. This, like, we don't realize this. We say, oh, that's something that changed. We think that that's different now. But actually, it has kind of catastrophic consequences that we don't really understand until a long time later. So, in terms of what I think has been most helpful for me, in understanding, the world that we're in, and helping my own personal writing projects, and philosophical development, has definitely been the spatial aspects. Although I am very intrigued by the gray ecology and the aesthetics aspect that Joshua is doing. But in terms of just like what has been most helpful for me, and I think that if you are out there and if you are a philosopher or a would-be philosopher, and you want to understand critiques of technology, Virilio is very good for that. He will be very helpful to your development in forming a critique of technology or a philosophical understanding of technology. And if you're interested in space in any way, like for me, that's really been really important. He's definitely somebody who I think is going to be seen as one of the key spatial philosophers in, like, say, 100 years from now, looking back on our time. He will be understood, I think, as one of the key spatial philosophers.
Right. Yeah, so I've just got some questions now that are definitely, as like I said, someone who hasn't read Virilio, and they just came to my mind in preparation for this conversation, and they've come to my mind throughout this conversation. So, so feel free to say to get the answer to that, you'll have to take the course, because I think that's fair enough. We want to get people to take the course. But basically, is Virilio, and this is an interesting question when it comes to thinkers like Heidegger, to be honest, because it's actually kind of an open question. Is Virilio ultimately pro or anti-technology?
So basically, Virilio is consistently accused of pessimism, left, right, and center. That's something that he's responded to over the course of his life. He has some very funny answers to that. So on one aspect, the idea that I think it's often presented, that, oh, he's reactionary or something like this, but he is defending a mode of realism where it's like, hey, sort of accelerating sort of like technical advancement is something that is, it's a given. There's no stopping technology. There's no way to get it back into the box. As far as other thinkers on technology, he has sort of, on the one hand, he has exemplified or has indicated respect for Heidegger as far as his analysis of technology, who he has the best analysis of, abstract analysis of technology, while at the same time saying that's proof that you can be a good philosopher and at the same time be monstrous. He calls him the perverted master. At the same time, he might be put in a camp similar to like Jacques Ellul of the Technological Society. I think that there's definitely some harmony between those two thinkers. And then on the extreme fringe, let's say like the Unabomber, he and Sylvain Lotringer, who is the is the publisher of Semiotext and is one of the perennial interview partners of Virilio while he was alive. Is somebody who they analyzed the Unabomber mutually, and basically they're saying, hey, you know what? There's an aspect of his analysis that is really quite good. They just thought that his solution sets were terrible and basically impracticable and so forth.
Yeah.
So basically, he assumes that there is going to be a progression of technology. He looks at it as a sort of, there's almost a perverse miracle bound up with this. So on the one hand, it's quite wonderful, but on the other hand, you have basically the 20th century is an epoch that can be looked at as exemplifying some of the worst catastrophes in human history. And that's something that he wants to sort of demonstrate. He wants to expose that. He had a museum exhibition that was just literally based on demonstrating the catastrophes of the 20th century. It's an idea for, let's say, a technical progress accident museum. And, that's what he was showing. So, he's showing like the Toulouse fertilizer plant. He's showing, let's say the invention of the cyclotron, things of this nature, what unfolded from them. And he's also doing it in a backdrop where he's constantly engaged with the Italian futurists who he points out basically wanted to destroy the museums, because they basically are worshipers of the future in some sense. So ultimately, he made a one gesture that he makes at a certain point is he indicates that to his mind, even though he was interested in trying to cultivate a technical progress accident museum where we would seek to develop some sort of understanding and collective self-awareness of, our ultimate telos here, he pointed to television as in some ways constituting a museum of catastrophe, in the sense that the 24/7 news cycle is just sort of streaming these in a nonstop fashion. At the same time, they're sort of re-territorialized within the propaganda of progress in some sense. And, basically from there, here's an even more overarching solution, and I'm happy to talk about it because it's quite open-ended, but he's saying really in order to achieve the preventative intelligence necessary to stave off a fully integrated sort of accident in the future, we need to cultivate a university of disaster, which would basically fix our, let's say, philosophical intelligence upon trying to assess this particular problem set.
Yeah, it sounds like he almost thinks that speed is inevitable, and when it comes to the practicalities and conclusions of that, there are probably like good sorts of speed and bad sorts of speed, right? Like it's a lot more nuanced than pro or against. But on that topic, is there an opposite to speed? Do we have a choice?
Well, actually, one thing he suggests is that we create a political economy around speed, which again is like, what the hell does that mean? And again, you have to do the course to really understand. But I think that what we could gather from the opposite of speed would be some sort of buffering or slowing, and I think that this might involve a kind of reworlding. We have to actually exist in the world again because there's a de-worlding which goes on with speed. We're sort of abstracted to this de-worlded mediation of reality. So what would a political economy of speed look like? See, it gets tricky because you're kind of talking about a phenomenological issue, and you're talking about like, how do you regulate a phenomenological problem? And I think it does relate basically to kind of what Joshua was saying with cultivating a preventative intelligence. And I'm now kind of thinking preventative intelligence could be in the category of what Aristotle called phronesis, which is like a kind of practical wisdom. That, modern science is very, very good at abstractions. It's very, very good at kind of technical solving, but it's not good at the good old Aristotelian, like, practical wisdom. One issue, for example, with speed is that Virilio says that it destroys our ability to see peripherally. So with speed, we focus in on something very specifically, and we can't see the peripheral vision. It's going to make sense if you're in a car and you drive very fast, even on a practical level. You tend to not be able to focus properly. Everything in the side starts to kind of blur, and you can only see one thing. So and as Virilio asserts, this is important because accidents and contingencies never come from in front; they come from the sides. So this is why he says animals that evolve with a lot of predators around will often have eyes on the sides of their heads, not in the front of their heads, because they need to see the sides, because predators come from the sides. So in a way, when we're talking about a buffering or a slowing, we're kind of talking about, like, it's not just a kind of like regulating the practical use of technology, although we can talk about that as well, and that's obviously probably is necessary as well, right? But we're also talking about, I would say, the cultivation of an awareness, insofar as that we've become very focused on, for example, what's ahead, and we've lost the ability to see contingencies and accidents on the periphery. That's one example. So how do we then sort of expand our view? That might be a kind of more kind of pragmatic response we could have with speed, for example.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the word intelligence there, and I have to ask this because there's something that came to my mind. Is like, what would Virilio say about what is being called in the current zeitgeist AI?
Yeah, basically, I'll just first answer with the sideline sort of issue, because, like, he is analyzing cyberspace in a very, very early sort of time here. We're talking like 95, 96. He's writing in texts like Digital Delirium. He's engaging with a whole bunch of theorists of technology, and he's citing things. I was very surprised at how early this was, but he was talking about body suits or data suits being bound up in sort of like the delivery, or, like the very early delivery mechanisms that are connected with the idea of virtual reality and so on and so forth. He says that, so now, like, the question here, and I'll work to putative AI, what have you, is the idea that he thinks that basically cyberspace is the accident of the real in some sense. And, like, you can look to Deleuze and Deleuze's analysis of, let's say, the difference between, the, like, reality, the virtual, the actual. I guess we could say, to the extent that cyberspace is rational, it is the real, but at the same time, it's not the actual. And so I think that that's something that Virilio would affirm. Furthermore, like, let's say AI seems very much bound up, like, with, let's say, the Bratonian project of planetary scale computation. Benjamin Bratton, he wrote the sort of the intro to Speed and Politics, at least one version of these things, and he's kind of like a sort of like a left Virillian, if you can state it like this. I think that this sort of metric fixation is something that is quite foreboding, in the sense that it lends itself to a certain sort of technocratic mindset. So now, if we apply the overall analysis as I've read it in Virilio, what I think that we're looking at is the potential technical destructuring of democracy through so-called planetary scale computation powered by, large language models and so on and so forth. And this is where I would say, like, Virilio and even Baudrillard and all of these individuals, their engagement with somebody like, let's say, Fukuyama and his sort of his prospects for the end of history and the last man, what have you, basically come to the fore, where I think that Virilio's work consistently points to the development of basically what I'm calling a mode of open tyranny that's just based on, technical domination. And I think you could make the case for that with all sorts of direct quotations, and that therefore so if you take large language models, putative AI, what have you, and then you reintegrate that within the propaganda of progress and the presentation as, basically placing under erasure all of the negative potential implications and only promoting and basically using advertising hype to, suggest the beneficence of whatever it is. This is a completely unrealistic picture of the world. But you could also say, so I think he has a very funny quote at some point where he basically indicates that, consumer society requires optimists. And so he doesn't necessarily identify as an optimist in the sense that you're not going to see Virilio being quoted by somebody such as, let's say, Steven Pinker at Harvard. His presentation, in my view, is just much more hardened, much more gritty, much more rigorous to the actual reality of what is going on if you're not busy sitting around sipping lattes, basically at Harvard or otherwise.
Yeah, I suppose to echo your point on cyberspace, academia is also sort of rational but not real, So anyway, how does one be an archaeologist of the future?
I'll give that one to Joshua.
Yeah, I would say that basically, and where I found that was he had a partner in his early project, which was Architecture Principe, where he was involved in what he calls the function of the oblique. It was just a certain analysis of architecture. This was with a gentleman named Claude Perron. And eventually they split over the 1968, the May 68 protests and so forth. Virilio was more political, whereas Perron was not as interested. And so basically they split at that point, but then came back together, 20, 30 something years later. And so Perron described him as an archaeologist of the future in a blurb in a certain, for a certain art presentation that he was involved in. And so I think that it's his analysis of the accident and the idea that the catastrophe is always already contained within any sort of technical progress. This is also a theme that is in Hannah Arendt, and he cites her as well, but it's just his sort of, he shows this almost analytically in a way that I don't think has been presented quite like that before. And so as a result of that, let's say in Nicholandian type terms, you were to claim that Neo-China has arrived from the future. Basically, there is a Virillian analysis of that predicated upon, basically this, it's almost a science of disaster.
Yeah.
That is why.
And I suppose on the topic of disaster and accidents, I'm just sort of wondering about the connection between speed and accidents, because, I mean, at least things that come to my mind, and correct me if I'm completely wrong in the direction I'm going with this in terms of Virilio, but it almost seems like major disruptive inventions in technological process, they are accidents also. I mean, like, what is the printing press but an accident of religious fervor? What is, the indexing of the web but an accident of, dissemination of information? And there's obviously the invention of penicillin, which was where someone accidentally left a sandwich to go moldy in a lab somewhere.
Yeah, so you're basically right there. Like the accident is not just in the bad use of technology, it's underwritten as a substance within the technology. That's kind of the main Virillian point, because and again, I'm not sure if he coined this, he might have, but this phrase that you hear a lot nowadays, which is You invent the ship, you invent the shipwreck. You invent the car, you invent the car crash. That's basically it. So yeah, it's kind of in the substance of the inventions itself. So the invention is happening while the whatever they are, the engineers, the scientists, the people working in a lab, whatever they are, when they're actually researching, even the accident is happening. It's not even just it's not just a bad use of something. It's in the knowledge creation and in the technical building of whatever, like machines, tools, techniques. I would also just add on top of that, and this is up for debate because I'm not sure what has exactly what order to put this in, but like the accident is also related to the state of emergency and the kind of state of panic that we're in and the emotional synchronization. Now, the question is, does our state of panic cause the accident, or does the accident cause the state of panic, or is there kind of just a feedback loop in between the two? Because Virilio will write a lot about, for example, the warfare is one of the big issues that Virilio brings up a lot, and states of emergencies are very relevant to war because when you're in a state of war, you're in a state of emergency. So that's another element to it. And I think Virilio, being someone who grew up and lived and saw the Cold War years and the nuclear threats and so on, I think he's interested in how like panic responses, perhaps rational panic responses, relating to a potential threat can sort of initiate, especially when it's intertwined with modern media technologies that seem to feed off and kind of create panic and then feed off that panic in a certain sense for perhaps political profit. We can think of the climate stuff going on. It's like, are people making money out of getting investments out of exaggerating reports from climate change? There can be a real threat, but the way we relate to it and the way we think about it and the way we respond to it can actually just kind of be caught into a cycle which doesn't really respond to the problem, which I suppose goes back to the issue of practical wisdom. How do we actually, we have a problem, it's a threat. How do we overcome the threat? How do we mitigate the threat? Well, sometimes that desire may be rational, but the way we respond may actually intensify the accident or bring it forth. So in that sense, I would say Virilio is actually like kind of a tragic thinker, because, in tragedies like the Oedipus story, you have these like situations where the people are trying to avoid, you have a prophecy, this man will grow up and he will kill his father and marry his mother. And the very act of trying to avoid that happening, which the parents take, they get rid of the kid and leave him in a field, and a farmer raises him, blah, blah, blah. That very act then sort of turns and actually causes a catastrophe. So I would say, I'm not sure if that exactly answers your question, but those are some thoughts anyway.
Cool. So I think that should have whetted people's appetites for Virilio. I've got lots more notes and other questions and stuff, but I think I'm going to save them for the seminars. So yeah, where can people find the course? What do people get? And when is all this stuff like the seminars going down?
So as far as the course is concerned, we're starting on November 4th. It's running every Saturday at 2 p.m. EST, and we're going to go for 2 hours. We're going for 6 weeks. One of those weekends, we're going to take off for the holiday in the U.S. And basically, so what is included is 6 video lectures, a couple of essays and course materials, essays by Owen. I have 2 by myself, and then some other stuff. And each week we're going to go through a reading of basically the most appropriate Virilio text for the subject matter, relatively short snippets. We're trying to give an overview of his entire corpus of work. And, we will analyze, interpret, draw out all the implications and, future potentialities and so forth. If you haven't read Virilio before, I definitely recommend him. And I always recommend The Administration of Fear, this very short interview book, which just gives you a really good flavor of his overall project. And, basically, I think you'll be very, very impressed. And, if you find his sort of world picture half as illuminating as Owen or I have, chances are you'll be glad you did. And so anyway, basically, if you use the coupon code SPEED, you can therefore get $50 off the cost of the course. And, hey, we'd be very happy to have you. And is there anything you want to add to that, Owen? That's basically, I'm good on my end.
No, that sounds good to me.
Cool. Cheers, guys. And yeah, but I guess before I leave, I want to do a last question. You can either answer this together or individually. What's the next course?
Well, I go first. I'm planning something on Play-Doh, but it's a long way off.
Okay.
And for me, I would either do something like the University in Ruins, where I would be looking at authors such as Bill Reddings and sort of like the theoretical sort of meltdown of the U.S. college and university system, the research ideal, and what that entails. And so it would either be that, or it would be the University of Disaster, where I would be taking sort of Virillion sort of thematic, and then sort of moving it into the digital sphere, and trying to sort of question and draw out the implications of what everything that entails.